want to thank Kim for joining us today and being a part of leading in worship. Didn't she do a masterful job playing the harp? Thank you. Very beautiful. So good. We have been in a series in which we've been looking at how to unite together, how to be like-minded. And we've seen already the importance of uniting ourselves with Christ, of uniting against the adversary Satan, and in uniting together for the welfare and betterment of other people. But that's not always easy. And so today I want us to reflect upon how to unite within ourselves, how to come together and come to peace within our own minds, our own hearts, our own souls, and how to get to a point where we truly can forgive those who hurt us, who say unkind things to us or about us, who undermine our work, or who make life very difficult for us. What is our response, and how can we unite together and be like-minded with the mind and the heartbeat of Christ? Chuck Swindoll used to tell a story about a man he met on one occasion in Chicago, and this young man had been a seminary student and didn't have a church to serve in at the time, and he was just kind of getting his education and getting started in church life and serving in church life, but he needed a vocation. He needed a job to be able to make ends meet, and the first opportunity he got to get employment was to work as a city bus driver in southern Chicago, which is not a very wealthy part of town. And as he was driving his bus route, he quickly learned that there were some suspective people that would ride on those buses at times, and at times they would be very gang-related. On one particular occasion, he picked up a group who got on the bus, obviously a part of a gang, and who refused to pay their bus fare. Well, this young man didn't know what to do, so he just went ahead and drove his route with them on the bus. Well, they started to do that every single day. One day, he passed a policeman on his bus route with the gang on the bus. And he decided he would pull the bus over and seek assistance from the police officer. The officer got on, learned about the situation, forced the gang members to pay their fare, and then the officer got off the bus, and the bus got on down the road. Well, you can imagine what happened at that point. The gang decided to retaliate on the young man, beat him, and robbed him. Well, sure enough, the man decided to go and report it to the police station. So he goes to the police station. He gives descriptions. The officers brought in that was on the bus that could witness who was there. He was brought in. They found and rounded up all of those who had attacked and stolen from the bus driver, and they brought him into the police station and began to question them. And the more that this young seminarian student learned about the circumstances of those who had attacked him, the more he began to have his heart go out to them. He understood that they were from broken homes and oftentimes didn't have money to provide food, and that they had parents who were strung out on drugs, and on and on and on the stories went, and it just really got to him. And so he went to the court case where they were going to be tried, and he petitioned the judge to see if the judge would allow him to take the jail time and the sentencing of those who had attacked him. And when asked why he would do this, he said, "Because I want to get to a point to where I can truly forgive them." Well, the judge denied the request and forced those who had committed the crime to actually pay their time. But during that time period that they were in jail, this young man went to visit with every single one of those who had attacked him. And rather than condemning them and looking down on them, his heart broke for them, and he began to tell them about how much Jesus had made a difference in their lives, in his life, and how much he wanted Jesus to make a difference in their own. Friends, that is what forgiveness is. It's not just mentally getting to a point to where we say we forgive with our words, but it's changing the course and the direction of how we view another person and a situation we've experienced with that person. It has a lot to do with what we left off last Sunday looking at with the attitude of our hearts. We looked last week about how it's God's role to judge other people. But it is our role to judge our own motives. And so picking up on that today, I want to turn briefly to Colossians and then to the words of Christ and see if we can't gain some insight in how to do this very difficult task of forgiveness. In Colossians 3, verses 13 and 14, just jot the reference down. You can go back and read it more in depth later. But listen to the words that Paul says to the believers there in Colossae, but also indirectly to you and to me. Bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you have a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Now, I have a particular fondness towards bears, but that's not the kind of bear that's being described here. Instead, the Greek word here speaks of holding up someone or keeping them from falling. We have a dining room table at our house, and Joel learned a very bad habit from his dad of leaning the chair back. Anybody ever have that challenge either with you or your kids? You tend to see how many legs you can actually hold yourself up on. Well, Joel likes to do that. And oftentimes, Michelle will come in and say, Joel, please, put your chair down. Right? What is she doing? She's trying to prevent him from falling. She's trying to hold him up and keep him from getting hurt. That is what it means to bear with one another. It doesn't mean that you just make the best of it. It doesn't mean that you just find some way to cope. But it means that you become actively involved in helping each other to stay upright. And then he goes on, if that's not hard enough, and he says, forgive. And he doesn't just say forgive those who come and say they're sorry. He doesn't just say forgive those who had good intentions. But he says forgive each other of any and every grievance that you have with whomever it is. This word that's used here describes grace. It's a variation of the Greek word charis. And so it means extend what is not deserved. They don't deserve for you to embrace them with this kindness. They don't deserve for you to extend them love. But remember last week, we are not to judge other people. Our own motives is where we are to judge. And when we evaluate our hearts, am I extending kindness to this person? Am I extending grace? How? In the same manner that Jesus extended it to us. Now it's no longer about what they deserve. Because, praise the Lord, we didn't get what we deserve. Jesus doesn't treat us the way that we should be treated. He doesn't give us justice. He gives us mercy. And that is the measure by which we are to extend grace to others. Back at the beginning of the series, we talked about love, and that love comes full circle when it is complete. It starts with God. He extends his love towards us. We share that with each other, and that brings us to a point of praising and celebrating what God is doing. And I would suggest to you that's exactly what happens when we bind these things together, as Paul talks about here. If you're going to bind something up, you're going to take a rope, you're going to take some twine, you're going to put it all the way around it and tie it in close. That's the description of what Paul calls us to do here, to bring love full circle, to pull each other in close, and to bind each up together. Tall order, huh? Not easy. Especially when you've been hurt, wronged, persecuted, not given the benefit of the doubt, mistreated, spoken of ill. Those are the times it's really hard. But Jesus gives us some guidance and instruction and a process about how to go about doing that. And so I want to take the remainder of my time this morning and turn with you to Matthew chapter 18 and walk you quickly through what I see as a 7-step process that will help us to forgive. The reason why we oftentimes fail to forgive is because we just think that is jumping to step number 7. Well, I'm supposed to forgive them. I don't know how I'm going to do it. I'm going to act good. Fake it till you make it. I guess I'm just going to fake that I forgive them when deep down inside I haven't forgiven them. And we have not walked through the process that Jesus outlines here. Now, I'll tell you up front, it's not an easy process, but it is the process to peace. And sadly, in my life, there have been too many days where I have elected to not have peace because I have elected not to forgive. But I have never once gotten to the point that I have truly forgiven and not experienced peace. So if you're here today and there's trouble in paradise, there's hardship in relationships, and there's tension, I would encourage you to consider this process. And if you're here today and you don't have any of that going on, just bow your head, praise the Lord, thank Him that it hadn't happened yet, and get ready because it's coming tomorrow. Take these steps, put them in your back pocket, because you will need them, I will need them, as we continue to follow the Master's instructions and we try to learn to forgive as He has forgiven us. All right, Matthew 18, 15 through 22 is all we got time for, if that, today. Beginning verse 15. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault, just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you've won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you that if 2 of you on earth agree about anything that you ask for, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there I am with them. And then Peter, of course Peter, came up to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? And Jesus answered, I tell you not 7 times, but 77 times. All right, you ready? Got your running shoes on? Step number 1. Go to the person. Jesus begins and he says that if there is anybody that you have a grievance with, you need to go talk to that person. He does not give any exceptions. He does not say, go and talk to your spouse, go and talk to your friend, go put it on Facebook, go seek counsel from your deacon, your pastor. He doesn't say, go and consult with the rest of the world on what's the popular opinion to do. He says, get up where you are and go to that person. And that doesn't mean there isn't opportunity, which we'll get to later, to seek counsel from other people. But your first order of responsibility is to not let time go, not let things linger and fester, but to go and express to that person that you care about them and that you want to seek restitution. Go to the person. I know it's our tendency that we don't want to ruffle any feathers. Our makeup is that we want to avoid conflict and we want to avoid addressing situations out of fear we're going to make it worse. Your fear is making it worse. Certainly pray. Seek God's counsel. But go to that person. If you're upset with somebody in this church and you come to me about it, my first question is going to be to you. Have you gone and talked to that person? Our responsibility as brothers and sisters in this human race is to directly address situations with one another. If out of respect for no one else, respect for their Maker. We must accept our responsibility and go to the person. He even says, do this just between the 2 of you. Pull away in private. Sit down. Listen. Talk to them. Get it out on the table. I'm jumping ahead. Number 2, express hurts. Express how you feel. Express what you've experienced. Now, some translations, I think, translate the phrase here incorrectly. The NIV does so. It says, show him his fault. But really the phrase more accurately means expose what is wrong. To me, the connotation of show him his fault puts all the burden and blame on the other person. And 99% of the time, there's shared blame and responsibility over any kind of conflict that's happened. If I just go to another person and tell them all the things that they've done wrong, I've done what? I've judged them. Remember, that's God's role, not mine. But it is my role to evaluate my emotions and what's going on inside of me, and to be honest and transparent with the people that I care about, and I should care about those in my life enough to go and sit down with them and express my hurt. So I'm going to give you a formula of what I think is the best way to do it. You can adapt it, you can disagree with it, but I would suggest you use some variation of this statement. I was hurt when you. I was hurt when you said that yesterday. I was hurt when you didn't call me back. I was hurt when I went to go meet you and you weren't there. I was hurt by what I heard from someone else that you might have said about me. Don't make assumptions and begin to speculate as to why they did what they did or what their intentions were. You don't know those things. You are only an expert on one human being on this planet, and that's the one that you look at in the mirror. You are not an expert on anybody else. Why they did what they did, what their reasoning was, what their motives were, you have no idea. You only know what's going on in you. Avoid saying things like, you are so mean, or you were being hateful to me, or even speculative statements like, well, you just did that because, or you did that because you think. We start to speculate about other people's intentions rather than looking at it from just our point of view. I love how Max Lucado put it, conflict is inevitable. Can we agree with that? But combat is optional. Every one of us are going to experience differences with other people because we're different. And that difference is going to create conflict. Every relationship will have conflict. But with God's help, no relationship necessitates having combat. So go to the person, express yourself, and then third, I would suggest actively listen. Actively listen. Now I realize in the passage, Jesus just says this one-sided. He says, if he listens to you. But can we operate off of some presuppositions about Scripture that I think transcend all passages? For example, Jesus consistently taught the Old Testament principle that I have a responsibility to treat another person the way that I want to be treated, right? So Jesus is not suggesting here that I need to go and if that person will listen, then things will go well. But he assumes that if I'm really wanting resolution, that I'm going with an intentionality to listen. I don't have any control over whether the other person listens or not, but I have control over my part of the equation, and my part is to go with an intentionality to listen to the other person. Now here's how I tend to happen in these kind of circumstances for me. Do not do what I do. I tend to hear about 5 words from the other person. And by that time, I'm already reloading my gun of how I'm going to respond in argument to those 5 words. I've already cut them off. I'm no longer listening to them. I've heard enough to gain my rebuttal. That is not actively listening. I'm trying to learn how to actively listen. And when I do that, it is much more successful. And so I'm going to give you 2 words to try to describe active listening. First, summarize. Second, validate. Active listening listens to understand the words and the emotion behind the words of the other person. I'm no longer interested in what I'm going to do or what I'm going to say, but I'm trying to really understand not just what the person's words mean, but what their emotions are saying about that. Because they may be emotional about a situation, they may not articulate it well. Can I look beyond what they're saying to how they're feeling and then validate that that is true for them? Now again, that's totally atypical to how I was raised. My human nature says that I don't need to be concerned about how they're feeling. I need to defend how I'm feeling. But that only leads to greater combat. Because now it's me not listening to that person and that person not listening to me, and us just duking it out. And there's just lots of bloodshed when that's over. But if I will stop and get out of myself and really start to listen to that other person, I can gain a lot more insight, and I can say, hey, you know, when I think about how you're expressing that, I can see why that's frustrating to you. Let me give you a personal example. Let's say that in coming in this morning, I came in late from life groups, went to the mic to get my mic hooked up in the sound booth, and let's say hypothetically, hopefully I didn't do this, but hypothetically I just walked right past you and didn't say hi. And I offended you by doing that. Whether it's my intention or not, I hurt your feelings. And let's say you've done steps 1 and 2, and you come to me after church today and you say, Patrick, I was hurt when you entered the sanctuary today, and you walked right past me, and you didn't even say hello. Now again, my human nature is going to start to explain to you why I did that. I was running late from life groups. I went to the sound booth. I had to get my mic checked. I had to do this, this, and this. I didn't mean to upset you or hurt your feelings. But then all of that discussion and my rebuttal is about me. Have I actively listened, understood, and validated them? A much better response would be for me to say, wow, I'm so sorry. That was not my intention at all. Please forgive me. I see that I walked right past you and probably just didn't even think about it. And when I did, I hurt your feelings. And I can see why your feelings are hurt by that. Please forgive me. Now whose perspective am I looking at it from? That other person. And that will oftentimes lead to reconciliation. All right, number 4. Seek win-win solutions. Seek a win-win solution. Anybody competitive like me? My lifestyle tends to gravitate towards win-lose solutions, and I only like one side of that equation. But true value of another person honestly seeks to bring about and cultivate a solution that is a success for both people involved. Again, Jesus addresses this only with the other person, but I think it's applicable to both sides of the relationship. He says, if he listens to you, you've won your brother. Well, guess what? If you listen to him, you've won your brother too. It's a win-win when both sides take turns listening to each other and seeking some kind of negotiated compromise of a solution. Everyone walks away a winner. For this to happen, both parties have to truly listen, seek understanding, and strive towards reconciliation. Now, footnote, you don't have any guarantee that that other person is going to do it any more than they have of you. You only have responsibility of what happens on your side of the street. I've got plenty to work on my side. I don't need to get bogged down on the other side. Seek a win-win solution. 5. Get help. This is step 5, not step 1. Jesus does not suggest that you go running to everybody else and stir them up about what's bothering you before you seek to bring reconciliation with that person on your own. But when you've exhausted your efforts to do so, Jesus guides us to get mediation. He says that it is appropriate, if that is unsuccessful, for us to go and get one, at most 2 other people, and to bring them into the situation. Now, here's what we tend to do when we do this. We go get people that we've already given our point of view to. They already have some form of obligation because they're our spouse, or they're our relative, or they're our friend, or they've heard our side of the story, and so we're building our army to go towards another person. That's not what Jesus is advising here. He's saying that we need to go and seek someone who can be a mediator, who can try to build relationship and reconnection. Not someone you can go and take to fight with you, but someone who can go and can fight for both of you to bring you together and harmonize the circumstances. And if that is not successful, he goes on to say, then take it to the church. Now let me make a confession here. Baptists are notorious for putting this into their constitutions to justify immoral, unchristlike behavior. It is my opinion in understanding this text and the nature of Jesus that Jesus never intended for anyone to be brought to the forefront of the church, displayed for all their sinfulness, and condemned by a body of people that are supposed to love one another. The intention here is that whenever there is still hostility, whenever there's still conflict, you consult with spiritual leadership and you bring them into the equation to try again to exhaust every possible means of building unity within the body of Christ. Not in a church conference where you sit there and throw stones at the sinner who's at Jesus' feet, but in private. You seek the advisement of church leadership on how to go about handling it. This is the appropriate step for you to go to your deacons. This is the appropriate step for you to go to your pastors. This is the appropriate step for you to go to those who are elder in their Christian journey and seek advice and help. When you've already taken those other steps to try to bring about resolution, and you need consultation on how to handle that. And if that is still not successful, Jesus admonishes us to treat them like pagans and tax collectors. Now again, whose role is it to judge others? God and God alone. It is not my role to judge anyone. In fact, I would suggest to you that again, this verse has been oftentimes misproportioned because really, how did Jesus treat pagans and tax collectors? He did not treat them by picking up stones to chastise them. He treated them by loving them enough to die on the cross for their mistakes. And we are to forgive. How did Paul say it in Colossians 3? As the Lord has forgiven us. Let me give you a couple of quick examples. I realize my time's up, but I want to finish this out. Y'all give me a little extension. In Acts chapter 5, there's a tragic story about a couple named Ananias and Sapphira. This couple, seeing others who had gone and sold all of their land and property and giving it to the church to help minister to the needs of those who were disenfranchised and suffering, they wanted to have that same glowing review, and so they went and sold their property, but they didn't want to give it all, and so they acted as though they were giving everything to the church, but secretly keeping part of it. There's nothing wrong with them having kept part of it. What was wrong was the deception. When this was identified within the church body, Peter and some of the church leadership address it with Ananias. Sapphira's not even there at the time. Later, they address the situation with Sapphira. God chooses to take their life for their wrongdoings, but that is not at the instigation of the church. The church didn't kill them. God chose their punishments. He is the judge over others, right? But they didn't have a big church meeting. They didn't call all the believers of Jerusalem together and say, hear ye, stands Ananias and Sapphira, here are their crimes, what should we do with them? But they lovingly confronted them for what they were doing and sought the favor of God. So much so it says in Acts chapter 5, verse 11, that great fear seized the whole church and all who heard about these events. They didn't hear about it because they saw it. They heard about it because news spread about what had happened within the church family. Now, that's a bad example, so I don't want to just end there. Let me give you an opposite example. In Acts chapter 18, we're told a fascinating story of another couple, Priscilla and Aquila, church leaders in Ephesus. And while they're leading the church there in Ephesus and they're going to the synagogue, a young, relatively new Christian named Apollos comes to town, and he begins to teach the believers there in the synagogue about the Lord. But he doesn't really fully understand all about Jesus, and so he simply is talking to them about John's baptism. And he doesn't have all the information correct. And Aquila and Priscilla could have easily said, "This guy's wrong, don't listen to him." But it tells us that they took him to their home and they sat down with him, and chapter 18, verse 26 says, and they explained to him the way of God more adequately. Now let's imagine you're Apollos and you're just on fire for God. You don't know everything, but you're just excited and you want to serve him. And you stand up and you just bumfuzzle it all. I mean, you just goof up. What would it do to your morale and your zeal for God if those who were leading in the church stood up and said, "This man has it all wrong"? Would you come back the next Sunday or Saturday? Would you want to continue to serve with that fervency? But what if somebody pulled you aside and said, "Man, I love that zeal you've got. Let me share with you some information that you may not have. I'll give you some things to think about. Some of the things we've experienced that go along with what you've experienced, and we've experienced it even more with Jesus. Let me tell you about him." That kind of loving compassion helps grow the church, whereas that negative condemnation destroys the church. I got to move on. Number 6, extend grace. Extend grace. I already mentioned this, but how did Jesus treat pagans and tax collectors? With love and compassion. Now, Jesus is suggesting that there is a time in this process where we may have to reevaluate the closeness of some relationships. If we've tried to make personal reconciliation, we've sought guidance from others that help mediate, and we've sought the advisement of church leadership, and we have still unsuccessfully brought things to a resolution, we may have to pull back from socializing with that person as much, and certainly may need to pull back from seeking advice or mentorship from that person. But he is not suggesting that we condemn them or X them off the list or burn bridges. I hear these kinds of phrases often. God never gave you a torch to burn a bridge. He gave you wood to build one. Our job is to build bridges with other people. You and I have no right to condemn another person to hell. I know that's blunt. We have no right to do that. We have no right to hope that somebody gets what they deserve. That's when we need to go back to the prayer room and ask God to do a work on us. We do have a right to follow Jesus' example of praying for those who hurt us, loving them, forgiving them, and extending grace to them. 7, I'll try to move quick. Bind and loose. We are to bind and loose. Verse 18, Jesus says, "I tell you the truth, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." And if you're reading this passage, you think, "Jesus, where in the world are you going with this? Because this has nothing to do with what you were just talking about, and I sure don't see where you're going with it in the verses to follow." But he's intentional about what he's saying here. Let me explain a little bit more. The Greek word for forgiveness is apheomai. It literally means to let loose, to let go. What might Jesus want us to let go of when we forgive? Bitterness, hostility, vengeful attitudes, even hurt. That's what it means to forgive. But notice the power in what Jesus says here. He says, if you can do that on earth, guess what? It opens up the floodgates of heaven and the potential of your life to invest in other people. You bind onto that, you hold onto that, you carry that around with you, guess what that's going to do? It's going to shut the floodgates of heaven, and it's going to limit your effectiveness as a Christ follower. If you and I want to be effective, we have to let go of every other person's hurt in our lives, just as Jesus did for us. And that is not easy, but it is transformational. And perhaps even more closely to what Jesus says, it is heavenly. You want to live a life that transcends this world? Then start living by the principles of that world. So if we're not supposed to hold on or bind to this anger and frustration, what should we hold on and bind to? The person. Because if I can bind to people who are hurting, and that's usually why people hurt other people, is because they're hurting, then God can use me to help heal them as He heals me. But I can never help anybody else when my hands are full with my own hurt and bitterness. I've got to let go of that frustration and hold on to the person. And if my illustrations are not vivid enough, go on and read the remainder of the chapter, because Jesus goes on to give a beautiful parable and illustration about how to live out this kind of lifestyle of letting go of the hurt and holding on to the other person. Letting loose of their throat so you can grab a hold of their hand. We are loose to experience the most abundant life when we let loose of the stranglehold of others and learn to forgive. So let's bind together as one. So what's the last thing on your listening guide? Then do what? Repeat. Repeat the process. In honesty, in our human nature, depending on the depth of the hurt, you may have to repeat the process multiple times for the same infraction of the other person. So Matthew puts this teaching right next to Peter's explanation or his inquiry. He says, Peter speaks up to Jesus and he says, now Jesus, how many times do I have to? You already see the fallacy of his question, right? How many times do I have to put up with and forgive this other person? Now, he probably does not even pause. In speech class, we talk about the intentional pause. He doesn't even pause there, but he gives his own answer, right? In the form of a question. He doesn't let Jesus answer yet. He just says, how many times am I going to have to forgive the other person? Is 7 times enough? Now, that's generous. You forgive another person 7 times. That's a lot. We actually have 7 steps. How many times do I have to follow these 7 steps you just given us? 7? Good number, right? I mean, good biblical number to throw out there. But Jesus in turn says, no, why don't you just multiply that number? There's a lot of debate among scholars about the appropriate number to use. Is it 7 times 7 or 7 times 70 or 7 plus 70? All that's equatable, but all of it misses the point. The point is, there's no number at the end of that equation. Or as Leon Morris put it, this is a way of saying that for Jesus' followers, forgiveness is to be unlimited. For them, forgiveness is a way of life. Bearing in mind what they have been forgiven, they cannot withhold forgiveness from any who sin against them. Hard stuff, huh? Perhaps no one on the face of the planet has had to forgive anyone more difficultly than Corrie ten Boom. I challenge you to read her story. Growing up during the Holocaust as a Jew. She says of one particular incident, and she doesn't cite the person or the circumstances, she said, I kept rehashing what this person did to me over and over and over in my mind. And I had trouble forgiving them for what they had done. For weeks this happened, and I couldn't sleep. I was troubled over this, and so I sought advice from a pastor friend. And he gave this analogy that stuck with Corrie ten Boom the rest of her life, and I hope and pray it will stick with me. He said, up in the church tower, there's a bell that's rung by pulling a rope. But you know, even after the sexton quits pulling the rope, the bell continues to ding, dong, ding, dong. But it's ever increasing faint as it softly begins to ding, dong, ding, dong. But if he goes back up and he grabs the rope again, it begins to escalate all the more. Ding, dong, ding, dong. In order for the bell to stop ringing, you have to let go of the rope. When we forgive, he said, we take our hand off the rope. But if we've been tugging at our grievances for a long time, we mustn't be surprised if the old angry thoughts keep coming for a while. They're just the ding-dongs of the old bell slowing down. I'm not asking you today to consider whether or not there's someone who you're having trouble to forgive. But I am going to ask you, would you take your hand off the rope? There is unity within us. There is unity in us when we forgive. Pray with me. Father, today we've experienced your forgiveness by coming to your table. We've been convicted of your forgiveness and our sins that put him on the cross. We are mindful of the importance to forgive, not for the wellness of the other person, but for our own. I pray that this week that I will take steps towards forgiving others and walking through this process that you've blessed us with through Christ's instructions. And I will do so mindful of the ways that you have been so gracious to forgive me. Help us as a church family to embody one of the most Christ-like attributes by learning to forgive one another. Lord, pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Tough one, huh? As a pastor, sometimes I'm tempted just to say the good stuff. But God doesn't let me get away with it. I wouldn't be doing my job to lead you if I just gave you the good stuff. I pray that God would use it in your life as he uses it in mine. And he would transform this world by us being the presence of Christ. They don't need me. They need him. And he entrusted us to show them who he is. God's speaking today about anything. You just want to come pray at the altar, or you have something you want to share with me, I'd be glad to pray with you and guide you through whatever God may be doing in your life. Let this be a time for us to reflect on his truth and how it can change us. Stand with me as Matt leads us in singing.